What I want to talk about is adaptive leadership. And adaptive leadership has been around for some considerable time now, certainly since the mid-1990s. And it's the work of Professor Ron Heifetz from Harvard Business School. Ron Heifetz discusses the principles of adaptive leadership, and there are two key elements to that. One that we see as the foundation of effective leadership, and the second, which is the pinnacle, which is the ability to be able to see across horizons. And there are 7 really principles to Heifetz's work. And the foundation is to protect the voices from below. One of the arguments that Heifetz makes is that no leadership is value-free. It's value-laden, and leaders need to lead with values. Another element of his work, supported by many contemporary writers, is that leadership can emerge from any point in the organisation, or of course a network of organisations. And in order to allow this to happen, what leaders need to do is to create the conditions to enable that leadership to emerge. Which is why one of his first principles is to protect the voices from below. It's to enable everybody's voice to be heard, so that the leadership is able to take the widest possible perspective. The pinnacle of the principles, and I'll talk about the principles in between shortly, is quite an interesting one, and it's about getting on the balcony. Getting on the balcony means that you're able to take a wider perspective of what's going on in relation to the whole of the leadership, whether it be for the organisation or within its networks. And by being on the balcony, you can get a much clearer picture. And what Heifetz talks about is not leaders being totally isolated up there on the balcony, on the roof, totally devoid of what's going on the ground. It's about moving between the two. Being on the ground so that you can be there supporting the people who are delivering what it is you're trying to lead. To understand the challenges and the priorities that the people who you vest the authority in are able to achieve what you want them to achieve. But then, every now and then, you need to get up on the balcony and take that much wider perspective. Because taking that wider perspective is going to enable you to be much more effective when you come to turn your vision into delivery. And that is what Module 4 is all about. The observant amongst you may well recognise that I'm actually in Dubai at the moment. And if you look over my right-hand shoulder, you'll see one of the most famous landmarks of Dubai, one of the tallest vantage points in the world, certainly one of the tallest hotels in the world. And that acts as a really good image for what I'm talking about in terms of adaptive leadership. Just join me and have a look at this view. So if you look here, you can see the tower here in Dubai, and there's an observatory which is giving an excellent view of Dubai, the whole of the city. If we look down here at the road, we can actually see patterns of traffic. And clearly at this time of day, which is round about midday, we can see that the traffic is much heavier going into the city than coming out of the city. Now, you wouldn't be able to see that if you were down there on the ground. And think of this in relation to leadership. Just have a look at the terrain of leadership, how it differs, and you'll be able to get a much stronger idea about how that approach can give you more options when you're looking at taking delivery from your vision and, most importantly, your values. Returning to Heifetz's 7 principles, I've talked about protecting the voices from below and getting up there on the balcony to get this much wider perspective. But what do we actually need to do in terms of responding to what Heifetz will call adaptive challenges, or what others, including Keith Grint, would call Wicked problems, not wicked in the sense that they're evil, but wicked in the sense that they're very, very difficult to respond to and to resolve. And very often, adaptive challenges, or wicked problems as they're called, rely upon partnership working, collaboration, working across networks, using creativity, innovation, all of those 4 golden threads that we are very clear about on our International Healthcare Leadership Programme. So how does Heifetz see this going forward? Well, the first step is what he describes as to identify the adaptive challenge. What is it that you're actually facing? And you can only identify that by taking that step back. And in many respects, it's also about differentiating between whether it's an adaptive challenge or what he calls a technical challenge. And a technical challenge is something that we've done before. There's a procedure, there's a process that we can call upon, and it's much easier to be able to deal with those technical problems. When we're looking at wicked problems, similar language, the opposite to that is a tame problem. And a tame problem equates to Heifetz's technical problem. And the adaptive problem is the wicked problem. And the most important aspect is to frame that problem in the first instance. And that's what identifying the adaptive challenge is all about. It's about acknowledging what it is you're facing, and how you can actually tackle that, but most importantly, who you will be able to call on to assist you in that task. So let's move on to the how question, that very important how question. We've considered the why. Why are we tackling this adaptive challenge? And Heifetz describes what I find to be a very useful analogy, which is what he calls creating the holding environment. Now that holding environment, it can be a physical space, it can be a meeting space where people get together and use traditional problem solving techniques to try and identify what sits behind the problem. But it can also be a virtual holding environment. And that is so important in today's world, and also important within the context of the learning on this programme. And Module 4 is no different to that, where we need to engage in virtual action learning. But that holding environment is where you can take that step back. Keep looking on the balcony, protecting the voices from below, but coming back into that holding environment to ensure that you are able to respond collectively to the problems that leaders are facing. And this is a really important aspect of taking the values and the vision and turning that into delivery. So within that holding environment, there are 3 more techniques that Heifetz introduces. Of those 3, the first is what he describes as cooking the conflict. What does that mean? In every aspect of work, we work with people, we work within relationships, and this is something that we've emphasised throughout year 1 of your programme. And whenever we work within relationships, there will be conflict. Some of us are better at dealing with conflict than others. And you may recall the Thomas Kilmann inventory that you undertook as part of Module 2, where you looked at your own style in dealing with conflict. But actually, and Heifetz is a supporter of this, that conflict can actually be positive. And when he talks about cooking the conflict, what he means is allow the issues to surface. Allow the issues that are leading to that context to come to that surface so that you can then tackle them. And it may mean putting on some pressure. It may mean having some very difficult conversations, again something that you learnt about in Module 2. But what he argues, and if you think about this in practice, every crisis leads to an opportunity. And if you're involved in a conflictual discussion, then you will be more attuned to ways in which you can deal with that. So that's what he means by cooking the conflict. And a lovely analogy for that, and one that I use quite often, is the pressure cooker. If you remember the old pressure cookers, not used so much today, but they have a valve, and you turn the heat up sufficiently so that you actually cook what's cooking. But you don't turn the heat up so much that it explodes, and that's what the valve is there to protect. The holding environment is in many respects that valve, that you need to cook the conflict, you need to turn up the heat every now and then, but you need to make sure that you don't turn up the heat so much that everybody ends up walking out of the meeting, or to use the pressure cooker's analogy, that your cooking just explodes and it's over. So that's the first element. The second element of his holding environment is to orchestrate the response to the problem solving, and that requires leaders to maintain disciplined attention, ensure that people are there physically but also, and importantly, mentally, ensure that they pay selective attention to the problems that you are facing. And the role of an effective leader is to orchestrate that. Think of the orchestra. You're bringing people together and you're enabling people to start problem solving together. So you've dealt with the conflict. You're now trying to maintain that disciplined attention. And then when you feel it's ready and the time is ripe, you then give the work back to the people who can make it happen. And you can only do that if throughout all of this you've been protecting those voices from below, that you've been enabling those conditions that will allow people to emerge, leaders to emerge from any part of the organisation, whether they are formal leaders or not. And Heifetz also talks in some detail about the importance of informal leaders, something that we will be talking about further in Module 5. So those are the three principles. The three elements of the holding environment: cook the conflict, maintain disciplined attention, give the work back to the people who can make it happen, and then most importantly, keep going back between the balcony and what he calls the dance floor. You know, up on the balcony, as we saw here in Dubai, you can see a lot more at a much higher level. You can see the patterns emerge before you. For Heifetz, he talks about the dance hall. Up on the balcony, you can see the patterns of dancing. Down on the dance floor, you can only see the feet, you can't see the patterns. Same applies with leadership. So, in summary, Heifetz's work on adaptive leadership I find to be a very useful way of thinking of leading within a complex environment. The world is complex. It requires leadership that is adaptive to those complexities. And as we go through Module 4, we'll be calling upon adaptive leadership before we then start to consider the strategic leadership element of this programme and looking at how values and vision can actually be turned into delivery, which is the core teaching on Module 4.